Hello and welcome to the Equip Project podcast. Jim, we're going to be doing something a bit different this week because I want to start this episode by responding to a couple of questions we had off the back of episode 1. In episode 1, we talked about the impact of COVID-19 on the church, and we're really keen just to engage with our listeners a bit more, have a bit more of a back and forth conversation. And we had a question from John on Instagram, and he said, Jim mentioned needing to obey the government on restrictions, etc. Agreed, but at what exact point would it be amoral to do so between here, as in our present situation, and a complete ban of worshipping? And then we had a very similar question from another listener who asked, what is the biblical view on state control? So just before we get into today's topic, how would you respond to these great questions?
Well, they are great questions, and we could spend the whole episode talking about them, but given the complexity and the sensitivity of the topic that lies ahead of us this week, I'm just going to give a quick answer, Ollie, if that's okay, and then we'll maybe put a fuller answer up on the website.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that okay?
That's the plan.
Okay, so the New Testament is crystal clear that we should obey the state. And remember that when Paul and Peter were writing their epistles, the state wasn't exactly a mature democracy. Some early Christians had to live under the Emperor Nero. So the obvious question arises, how do we square their clear instruction about obeying the state with Peter's equally clear principle that we should obey God rather than man? And two quick points come to mind here. First, there's a difference between disagreeing with the state on the one hand and leading a rebellion against the state on the other. So imagine that the government here makes it illegal to teach the Bible's view of human sexuality in a public meeting of the church. I would courteously refuse to obey that law. But when the police came to arrest me, I would recognize their God-given right to punish me for breaking the law, whether that be through fines or imprisonment. In other words, I wouldn't loot shops or start a movement to overthrow the government. I would simply not comply and then recognize the state's right to punish me. The second point, which really goes to the heart of John's question, is what am I prepared to die for? And I think the book of Daniel is really helpful here. If you remember in Daniel, in chapter 1, he's confronted with a problem. It's a pretty simple problem. He's instructed to eat meat offered to idols or meat with blood in it, and that violated his conscience. But in that situation, he comes up with an imaginative compromise with the state. But then when you get to chapter 6, that's the story of the den of lions, Daniel refuses to compromise. And he is prepared to die because at that point in the story, the state was seeking to stop him from worshipping God. And that was a non-negotiable principle for Daniel. Now, that debate came up in the COVID crisis when a famous pastor in the United States called John MacArthur, he encouraged Christians to disobey the state and to meet together. Now, I have to say that his contribution made me really uneasy. I mean, just think of the impact of that statement on the Chinese government. They have this, as you well know, this paranoid fear that Christianity represents a threat to the well-being of the state. They think that Christians are basically insurrectionists. Now, if they got to hear John MacArthur's statements, their fears would be increased, and so the lives of our brothers and sisters in Christ would become even harder in China. So it's important that we never forget to show that we want to be good citizens in society, even when it diverges from our own worldview. So that's my 10,000 feet answer.
Brilliant. No, that's really helpful, Jim. And as you mentioned, the plan is to put up some additional content online. So if you guys want to dig into that topic a little further, we're going to put some further resources on the website. So let's kick off today's episode called Earth. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on the environment. And it's clear, you go on BBC News, you read about the wildfires in California. It's clear there's some massive environmental issues in our world today, and we hear about it almost on the daily. We hear about the impact of climate change, the destruction of the rainforest, the pollution of oceans, the mistreatment of animals. And it's a massive deal for governments, and in particular young people around the world. You think of movements like Extinction Rebellion, often led by members of the younger generations. The rise of veganism has also been massive. Apparently in the UK, the number of vegans has quadrupled in the last 5 years. And in light of this kind of backdrop, we as young Christians need to know how to think about and respond to these issues. So, Jim, the plan is to break the problem into 3 parts. It's going to be a little bit of a longer episode today because this is a massive topic. We're going to talk about climate change, we're going to talk about biodiversity, and we're going to talk about animal welfare and examine each of those in turn. So to begin with, Jim, let's look at the facts related to climate change, obviously a contentious topic. How do you understand the problem of climate change, and what are some of the high-level facts?
Well, your question is deceptively simple because there has been a great deal of dispute over what we might call scientific facts. And we're going to think about why in a moment or two. But we can start by talking about data which the overwhelming majority of scientists agree upon. So the planet's average surface temperature has risen by 0.9 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. And most of that warming has occurred in the last 35 years. Now, the evidence linking that temperature rise to carbon dioxide emissions is compelling. There is a vast amount of data available now that proves beyond reasonable doubt that human activity is leading to a dangerous rise in global temperatures. The IPCC put their certainty at 95%, and that is higher than the certainty that smoking causes lung cancer. Now, I mention that because people who deny climate change, and there are some evangelical Christians who do, they have a big problem on their hands because we don't need 100% certainty before deciding to act. That would be like a lung cancer patient arguing that they need not give up smoking because the link between smoking and cancer isn't 100% proved. Now, the consequences of climate change are more difficult to define. You can see its effects on retreating glaciers, shrinking ice sheets, the increased acidification of oceans. But maybe the main consequence will be much more extreme weather conditions. Now, the changes in the Earth's processes operate over a very long time, so I'm a wee bit suspicious of claims, that every storm or every heat wave is a consequence of climate change. But the settled view of the scientific community is that long-term climate change will increase droughts, floods, and other extreme weather conditions. And the crucial point here is that it's the people in the global south, in places like Bangladesh, who will suffer the most.
Okay, so that's climate change. Let's take biodiversity then. Because the science here seems to be more certain.
Yes. So just to clarify, when we talk about biodiversity collapse, we're referring to the mass extinction of different species. So there is a natural or a background rate of biodiversity loss. Even minor changes in the environment can cause species to become extinct. But the rate of extinction now is at least 1,000 times higher than the background rate. Now, some people argue, correctly I suppose, that the planet has recovered from about 5 catastrophic collapses in biodiversity in the past, after asteroid strikes and things like that. But it cannot be right that humanity is treating the other species of Earth in the same way as an asteroid does. Marine life has been hardest hit. I was astonished to read that half of the different species of fish eaten by humans has become extinct since 1970. Corals are under serious threat. 8 million tons of plastic waste dumped in the oceans last year. So the biodiversity of oceans is a big concern.
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas that's been really highly publicized over the past few years is the whole plastic problem. And actually it's really important because it's so sad to see some of the images of animals caught up in plastic and that kind of thing. We seem to have made a real mess of the world as human beings, Jim. Finally then, animal welfare. This is the umbrella term used in conversations about the ethics of how livestock gets treated by industrialized agriculture, and it also covers the ethics of meat eating. This too is a broad area, but can you give us a bit of a bird's eye view of some of the issues faced here?
Yeah, it covers everything from hunting animals, using them for scientific experimentation or entertainment, the keeping of pets, but the main thing obviously is farming and fishing. And the basic question of our right to use animal products for food and clothing dominates the debate. Even young adults who are not vegan do worry about the industrialized processes used to produce beef and chicken and dairy products. Now, obviously, farmers should never treat animals with cruelty. But even if we assume that farmers follow best practice, an emotional argument remains, and it relates to the consciousness of animals. A lot of YouTube videos anthropomorphize animal behavior. So, in other words, they project human subjectivity onto a different creature. Now, animal and human brains share a lot of commonality. Animals can be curious. They can show basic rationality and empathy. And the atheist evolutionist sees the human brain as just part of a spectrum. It starts at one end with a jellyfish, and at the other end you have dolphins and humans. But building ethics on that position creates a logical mess. And I would encourage young adults to think about this. I now quote the well-known philosopher Gwyneth Paltrow. Now, she's not a complete vegetarian, But she confidently asserts that she will eat squid, but not calamari. Why? Because octopi have lots of neurons in their tentacles and are therefore too smart to eat. Now, what sort of an ethical framework can be built on the relative number of neurons in a creature's body? I think it's important to distinguish between sentience, which is a function of the brain, and human consciousness, which I think is a product of the human soul. I mean, we have no idea how it feels to be a cow. That's why animal welfare is such a really tricky problem to talk about, because it gets to the heart of the difference between a human and an animal, okay? Now, the main point remains. Animal welfare is vital for Christians to address, and I rather resent the fact that vegans think that they own the issue of animal welfare. It is possible for someone who eats meat to care deeply about the issue of animal welfare.
I'm still caught up with that issue of squid or calamari. Like, that's really concerning me. So how, I mean, her life must be really stressful. How does she decide what to eat on any given day?
I think there must be a chart of neurons per square inch.
That is really, wow. My mind is blown by that. But that's really helpful. That's really helpful, Jim. Let's try and pull these strands together then. Is there an argument to say that population growth potentially underlies all three areas?
I think it's a bit simplistic. I mean, it is true the world's population has grown from 3 billion to nearly 8 billion in my lifetime. That's an astonishing statistic. But the underlying cause, perhaps, is the rise in consumption. So Westerners cannot say, well, all the population growth is going on in the global south, so we aren't causing the problem. The West consumes an enormous amount of the Earth's resources. I mean, just look at what we throw away. Look at the upgrade culture with our technology. I mean, I'm going to give you the most shocking example of all. 40% of all food produced is wasted. So at the level of facts, the human contribution to climate change it's been caused by the use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And the main reason for the collapse in biodiversity is the destruction of natural habitats. Human agriculture has replaced 70% of the world's grasslands, 50% of savanna, 45% of deciduous forest, 27% of tropical forest. I mean, I read a statistic which blew my mind. In 2014, 45 million acres of tree cover was cut down. And that's a region twice the size of Portugal. And the main cause isn't subsistence farmers clearing fields. It's the drive for biofuels and those vast soybean fields needed to produce animal feed for beef farmers.
So, Jim, going over some of these facts, I mean, it looks pretty. It looks like a pretty grim, bleak situation. But yet, these issues are often still controversial. Thing of climate change in particular. Why is there still the kind of controversy around these issues?
You're right, and there are two main reasons why a lot of skepticism still hangs around. And the first one is the less important, and the second one is the more important. And the first one is that the science involved is incredibly complex. I remember once being shown a supercomputer that modelled wind patterns for weather forecasters, and it was by far the most powerful computer in the world at that time. It wasn't all that long ago. And yet it was still only able to make extremely rough approximations. I mean, the Earth's climate is controlled by a multitude of different variables. So when a scientist tries to cut through all that complexity and give a simple headline, a simple prediction, it almost always unravels. I mean, so if somebody makes a statement like, unless we cut fossil fuel emissions by X% in Y years' time, then global temperatures will rise by Z degrees centigrade, a skeptical critic can easily say, look, that is nonsense, because the statement ignores a whole set of other variables. So the first reason why consensus is difficult is that the Earth's climate is so complicated that scientists struggle to understand and articulate how it works.
Yeah, I think the complexity is definitely one big issue. Probably for me, one of the things I struggle with, Jim, is that sometimes scientists seem to massively exaggerate the situation as well. There seems to be a lot of scaremongering that goes on. So for example, in 1989, there was a paper published by the UN that predicted that entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth if the global warming trends weren't reversed by the year 2000. And that never transpired. I mean, we're still here.
That's right. I mean, when prophecies like that are shown to be false, then cynicism breeds. It's just the lesson of history. But the second reason why the issue is such a battleground is political. So the conversation we're having here, Ollie, isn't really a scientific debate. It's not as if we were discussing the merits of loop quantum gravity over string theory.
I would love to discuss that with you sometime.
Do you prefer your reality to be loopy or stringy?
That may be next week's episode, to be honest.
But the problem is that this debate over ecology has got terribly tangled up in a political dogfight between left and right. So let's take a really topical example. Last Sunday night, Sir David Attenborough, who of course is the patron saint of ecology, broadcast a programme called Extinction on the BBC. And St David ended with a monologue straight to camera, saying in effect that we were teetering on the edge of a disaster because human activity will lead to the extinction of millions of species. And at the time I thought it was a really compelling piece of filmmaking. But 2 days after the programme was broadcast, The Spectator magazine had an article rubbishing the BBC programme. It describes it, and I'm quoting here, as a one-sided green propaganda, a hysterical picture of apocalypse caused by capitalism. And I have to say, after I read that article, I thought that The Spectator had made a lot of good points.
Yeah, I mean, that illustration there just demonstrates how political the debate over these issues have become. I mean, on the one hand, you've got the liberals of the BBC putting out kind of their propaganda, and then on the other side, you've got the right-wing humanists of The Spectator just ripping any of that kind of thing to shreds. And ultimately, we have a kind of a complicated situation where the science isn't fully understood, and then that's bound up in politics. And actually the politics itself, what underlies the politics is really a clash of worldviews. You have a fight between the left and the right over humanity's relationship to nature itself.
That's right.
And actually, Jim, on that point, how would you define humanity's relationship to nature?
I think this is the root question. And let me say there are two wrong answers to that question, and then there is the Christian view of humanity's relationship to nature. So maybe let's start with the wrong answers, which are the ideologies of the right and the left. Now, both those ideologies are anti-Christian, so from our perspective, they're both wrong. So we'll start with that. In simple terms, we can characterize the right-wing view of ecology as the modernist view and the left-wing view as postmodernist. So way back in the 17th and 18th centuries, the modern way of thinking about the world arose. Man became the measure of things. He stood alone in the universe. It was the human spirit that would triumph over all our foes. And so modernists like Francis Bacon took the Christian idea of mankind as the stewards of nature, and they corrupted that, and they talked about man becoming the master of nature. Nature was a thing to be cultivated and brought under control. Every bit of wasteland would be transformed into a garden or a farmland, so we could tear up forests to build our cities, because the earth was man's plaything. In a universe where the fittest survive, human beings had triumphed over all the other species on earth. So modern man set about mastering nature, dominating nature. And that is in many ways what the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution represented, the triumph of man over nature. So modernity poisoned our understanding of the human relationship to nature. Well, then came the 20th century, and in the middle of the 20th century, the modernity project crashed and burned. Postmodernism took over, and at this point, that big story of humanity's triumphal march to victory was ditched, and things like the politics of identity started to drive the left's political thinking. So, I don't need to tell you this, Ollie, today the left sees all of life as a struggle between an oppressor and a victim group. That's why they talk about the white heteropatriarchy and white privilege. Women are told to break free from the oppression of men. The LGBT community's story is the escape from oppressive restrictions. And that same ideology, that same idea, is now applied to the debate over ecology. Except now the oppressor is humanity itself, and Mother Earth is the victim. Humanity, especially Western industrialists, are now the hated oppressor, and cute polar bear cubs are the victims. So the left's answer to the ecological problem is to overthrow the entire system of capitalism. Now, I hesitated before saying this, but there is one other feature of the left's view of ecology that we have to address, and that is that the green movement has become a religion. Please don't be offended. I don't mean that as an insult. I'm using the term religion in the technical sense of the term.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with that, Jim. I don't know if you saw Nancy Pelosi's remarks on the Californian wildfires recently.
No, I didn't.
She's a politician in the US, a Democrat, and she said Mother Earth is angry. She's telling us, whether she's telling us with hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, fires in the West, whatever it is, that the climate crisis is real and has an impact. And I just thought that language is so striking. The personification of the earth, and it sounds like something religious people might say about God.
Yeah, I mean, just think about the typical hallmarks of a religion. I mean, left-wing ecologists tell a story about an original sin called pollution, but the righteous can embrace the story of redemption through a works-based salvation, which is sustainable development. The whole thing is described as a vast cosmic struggle between right and wrong. The green religion even has its own apocalyptic vision. I mean, that's the thing which is causing this eco-anxiety. I mean, I'll never forget Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez saying, "We have 12 years to save the world. The world will end in 12 years if we don't change." Now, and it is that apocalyptic vision that is terrifying millions of teenagers today. Or think of something like carbon offsetting. Carbon offsetting is pretty close to the old medieval idea of selling indulgences. And this religion divides people into infidels and believers, with white capitalists placed firmly in the infidel camp. But at its deepest level, this new religion has a view of humanity and a view of God. To explain the green religion's view of humanity, think for a moment about ethical veganism. Now, let me be very careful here. Lots of vegans adopt their lifestyle because they're worried about the environmental impact of eating meat and dairy products, and that's absolutely fine. But ethical vegans are the people who say meat is murder. Okay? Their lifestyle is based on moral, not pragmatic arguments. And ethical veganism cuts to the heart of the progressive left's understanding of humanity. So in 1975, the philosopher Peter Singer published a book called Animal Liberation, and it triggered the animal rights movement. Now, at the time, his arguments were regarded as nutty and extreme. But I am slightly in awe of Peter Singer because he was a prophet. Nearly half a century later, that book reads like a standard textbook from the progressive left today.
Yeah, that's disturbing because I find Peter Singer a very scary guy. I mean, he would argue that certain animals have moral value, more moral value than a disabled child would. I mean, that kind of language and thinking is really quite shocking.
Yeah, but he says that because he defines personhood in terms of function. It's the ability of a creature to communicate and reason. Singer completely rejects the idea that human beings are somehow special or different from other species. So he argues that humanity is the oppressor species, mistreating victim species. And he actually coined the term speciesism, which he said was the idea that being human is a good enough reason for human animals to have greater moral rights than non-human animals. So that's the view of humanity. But as you mentioned earlier, the green religion even has its own god. She's called Gaia, or Mother Earth. Now, that is actually a very old idea. You find it in Hinduism. It's the philosophy called pantheism. Now, pantheism isn't the worship of the earth. Pantheism is the view that everything is part of the one, if you like. The universe and everything in it is God. And what we feel as individuality is just a disturbance of the one. So God, if you like, is the universe. So I don't think it unfair to describe the left's position on ecology as a religion. Now, remember that in Christian thought, both left-wing and right-wing ideologies are wrong. I'm not having a pop at any one. Right-wing ideologies lead us into Gnosticism. In other words, human beings are masters who rule over some useless matter called planet Earth. And then on the left-wing ideologies lead us into pantheism. The uniqueness of humanity dissolves into the absolute impersonal of the one.
Okay, so we've done a lot of really important groundwork there, Jim. And now we get to the Christian view of humanity's relationship to nature. Could you explain that for us?
Okay, so this is the third way, and in our view, obviously, the right way to think about the whole question of our relationship to nature. So within the Christian worldview, we start off by asking, what is God's relationship to his creation? And the answer is simple. He loves it. Read Genesis 1 and note the recurring phrase, and God saw that it was good. God thought creation was good before we came along. He loves trees and flowers and giraffes and dolphins. One of the most moving parts of Matthew's Gospel is when the Lord Jesus tells us about our Father in heaven watching as a little sparrow falls to the ground. Job talks about God's care for the ravens and the lioness. One of the reasons God didn't destroy the wicked city of Nineveh was because of the cattle they kept. So that gives us the right foundation. Ollie, when we are called to give an account of our lives to God, one of the things he will ask us is how well did we look after the creation he loves? So I'm going to suggest 3 principles here which underpin the Christian view of this question. First, humans are a community of creatures. Humans are part of the community of creatures. I would encourage everyone who seeks biblical wisdom in this area to start by reading Job chapter 38 and chapter 39. They're some of the greatest poetry ever written. And God takes Job on this great tour of his creation. He shows him a doe crouching down as she gives birth to her young. He makes Job listen to the wild braying of a donkey. He shows him a war horse rearing up in excitement as it charges at the enemy.
Yeah, I just to jump in there, Jim. I was reading this the other day, and it's kind of like a BBC documentary, but in the Bible. I absolutely love those passages.
That's fantastic.
Without the propaganda, but
and the wildness of them all. That's the whole point. Is about freedom. God has built freedom. Yeah. Now, there's lots of stuff going on in those chapters, but on the surface, it reminds us that human beings are part of the community of creatures. We were formed from the dust. So there's a kinship with the rest of nature. We aren't alien overlords who control the rest of nature. So we reject the Gnosticism of modernity. So that's the first principle.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge to that right-wing view of the earth in particular, the idea that God delights in it. And there's some Christians who would have the attitude that the world is temporary. It's all for the fire type language you'll sometimes hear. And that can lead to a flippant attitude towards caring for creation. What would you say to people who have kind of a sympathy towards that view?
Well, I would call them pure Gnostics. The first thing is that God loves this old world. You see, we should never confuse permanence with value. The Lord makes that point in the Sermon on the Mount when he talks about lilies. Why does God invest so much effort into creating a lily flower when it dies after a few days? And that's because God loves beauty. The value of a lily is not predicated on its permanence. The more substantial point is that in Christian eschatology, nothing good will get lost. I don't quite know how, but all that is good in this old world will somehow get transmuted into something even better in the new creation.
Yeah, that's helpful and challenging as well. So we've addressed the right-wing view. How might you challenge the left-wing view then?
Okay, well, in the previous answer I gave you, I was making the point that humans are part of the community of creation. But the second principle is that humans are unique. We are uniquely valuable as God's image bearers. And your generation, Ollie, has to be careful that your views on the environment don't lead you into pantheism. Never forget the huge gulf that exists between a human being and an animal. Yes, we are part of the community of creatures. We are formed from dust. But we are also made in the image of God. We are magnificent, moral, rational, spiritual creatures made in God's image. We have souls that will last forever. And if you read Genesis 1 carefully, you will see that there is as big a gulf between inanimate and animate life as there is between animals and humans.
And you haven't actually mentioned yet, Jim, the idea of biblical stewardship. That's an idea we find in Genesis 1, and I think it's highly significant when it comes to thinking about these issues. Where does that concept fit in?
Well, I deliberately left it to the end because it very often gets confused with the old modern idea of domineering nature and mastering it. So the third principle is that human beings have responsibility for the welfare of creation. We are called to cultivate it. See, not everything humans do is an act of vandalism. It is possible for us to live in such a way that the creation supports all living creatures in a mutually respectful way. But that requires us to feel a sense of responsibility for climate change, for the collapse in biodiversity, and for animal welfare.
Okay, so as we round things off, or begin to round things off, Jim, let's step through each of those three issues in turn. What should a Christian response be to climate change?
Okay, we'll get to the practical steps Christians might take in a moment, but I think it's important we establish the biblical framework first. It's interesting, in the book of the Revelation, it describes a whole series of ecological disasters that will come about in the last days. And those disasters are direct consequences of man's rebellious arrogance. They overthrow divine boundaries, and God's response is to remove the boundaries that keep nature in balance. Now, that principle should frighten any true believer, because we do not want to be complicit in any activity that alters the boundaries that maintain the beautiful balance in nature. If our activity causes the poorest people in the world to experience extreme weather or flooding or drought, then we have a duty to try to get the system back in balance. How we might go about that is a real question, but we should at least feel the weight of responsibility.
And what about the biodiversity problem?
Well, the key text here is in Genesis 1, which calls us to care for God's creation, to cultivate it and to respect it. The key issue here is, remember, God gave the land and its plants to the wild animals as well as to us. So we're expected to respect that principle. In the Old Testament, the Israelite farmers were to leave some of their fields fallow each year for the benefit of the wild animals. So we must not misinterpret Genesis 1 to say that we have the right to tarmac over every square inch of the planet. We are part of the community of creatures, and we respect that God gave the land to them just as much as he gave it to us. I think it's significant, when God says in Genesis 1 verse 30, "And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." Now, when he says that, he's talking to human beings. So it seems to me that the verse compels us to make sure that the habitat of wild animals should not be destroyed.
Yeah, that's compelling, Jim. Finally, then, animal welfare. How should a Christian respond to animal welfare issues?
The welfare of animals is a really important theme that runs through the Bible. I mean, the story of Noah and the ark, obviously, is a beautiful picture of man protecting and caring for creatures. Think of the book of Proverbs. It doesn't just command us to care for animals. It says that we should empathize with its situation. The mistreatment of animals is regarded as a wicked thing in Scripture. And all those insights into how we should treat animals are a reflection of how God feels about them.
I guess a big question arising off the back of animal welfare discussions is eating meat. And we could do an entire episode on this topic. I know previously, Jim, you've gone vegan in preparation for a talk you were giving on this topic, and I'd love you to do that again. I'd love to put you through that again. But maybe just really kind of quickly, because we don't have long, but just briefly, could you kind of summarize your take on that, and then maybe we'll put some additional resources on the website for people to follow up on that.
Sure. It is a really nuanced conversation, so we're not going to do it justice here. But in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were vegetarian. Now, they weren't vegan, but they were vegetarian. And I say that because even in Genesis 1, there is a distinction made between wild animals and livestock. So the keeping of domestic animals was part of God's perfect world before the fall. Then after the flood, God explicitly gives us the right to kill animals for food. And the only thing the New Testament does is to remove certain restrictions on the type of meats that we can eat. So it is perfectly biblical for a Christian to eat pork, for example. Our Lord himself ate fish. He must have eaten lamb at Passover times. Now, in his letters, Paul talks quite a lot about the choice to be a vegetarian. He makes it clear that no Christian should look down on a fellow believer who chooses not to eat meat. But at the same time, he says, he will not permit vegetarians to enforce their views on others or to enjoy a feeling of moral superiority. In fact, in one of his letters, Paul highlights the attempt to enforce vegetarianism as a form of false teaching. But it is a very complicated, nuanced topic, and there's lots of issues there. So I think, Ollie, the best thing to do is to put a fuller treatment of the question up on the website.
Brilliant. We'll do that. Finally, Jim, on a really practical level, what should we as Christians be doing in response to this discussion?
Well, this is the most important and the toughest question, I guess. I'm going to start by making some negative points. So an insight into my personality. Avoid virtue signaling, right? And be careful not to leap straight into political activism. We live in a world where politics has become sacred. So, I mean, political activism isn't necessarily wrong, but in terms of the Christian worldview, it resides at the shallow end of the swimming pool. Real change is effected in more strategic ways. So the first principle is to pray. I mean, I pray quite often for the scientists who are working on nuclear fusion. You know, the nuclear reactors we have at the moment produce all sorts of nasty stuff. But fusion would give us unlimited amount of clean energy. And I mean, I don't think solar and wind and batteries are going to hack it. Even after 20 years, they only give us 3% of our energy, and the long-term issues over waste disposal are horrendous. So we need to cry out to the Lord that in his mercy he will help us to solve climate change through technology. But the most important thing in this area to pray about is to pray against the idol called consumerism. We should ask God in his mercy to free the Western world from its love of accumulating stuff. We need to stop believing the lie that physical objects can bring meaning into our lives. So that's the first principle. Pray. The second principle is to consider a professional career that might help solve some of these problems. And I'm going to give a couple of quick examples. In the field of technology, some clever Christian bioscientist listening to us now, might want to start research into artificially grown meat. I mean, if we could get something that tasted pretty much like a burger or minced meat at reasonable cost, I think it would be ethical to use it on weekdays, for example, and then perhaps as a special treat, eat grass-fed beef. The most strategic work to be done in terms of career relates to economics. See, it seems to me that the root problem in the West is that we have commoditized food production. The big supermarkets have squeezed their supply chain so hard that farmers are forced to use industrial production techniques. Now, of course, ideally we would all love to eat grass-fed milk and beef, organic vegetables and so on. But at the moment those organic food lines are just a lucrative revenue opportunity that plays on middle-class guilt. And that brings me to economics. At its most basic level, we need a system that forces us to consume less and spend more of our money on sustainable food. So this is a really important statistic. In 1957, a typical household spent 33% of their weekly budget on food. Today, it is 15%. So we have to be prepared to spend more money on food. And that will mean less money spent on giant flat-screen TVs or holidays in far-flung destinations. I mean, I've, in my idle moments, wondered about a food tax on non-organic food or an extra tax on imported food, because that might tip us into buying locally sourced and sustainable food. Anyway, the point is, Christian economists should be doing PhDs on those sorts of topics. Okay, so the final principle I'm going to suggest is to make quiet changes in lifestyle. Changes made without fanfare should never appear on Instagram. But on a general note, one of our key ways to witness in this world is to stop consuming so much stuff. Having an ancient mobile phone is a great witness. Not spending ridiculous amounts of money on clothes, not insisting on a hot holiday every year is a great witness. Now, to get a bit more specific, eating locally produced, sustainably grown food is sensible if God has given you the financial resources to make that choice. Short supply chains are always a good idea. It's probably less environmentally damaging to eat a locally sourced bit of bacon than to eat an avocado. But having said that, cutting down a little on the amount of red meat we eat might be a good thing to consider. And plant trees. Planting trees is a practical and strategic response to the problem. So those are my three principles, Holly. Prayer, career choices, and lifestyle changes. Those are some of the practical responses a Christian can make to the challenge. You might also want to talk with your church leaders about the subject. I mean, obviously not in an antagonistic way or a lobbying way, but just a gentle nudge to make sure that the church addresses an issue, which many non-Christians think is the single most important issue facing humanity.
That's super helpful, Jim, and really, really practical. Just as we wrap up, I promise you this is the last question now. Are there any further resources on this topic you'd recommend for our listeners? I'll put them on the website.
Yeah, well, if you're interested in the background theology, I'm going to suggest two books. One is called The Bible and Ecology by Richard Bauckham. I have a lot of time for Richard Bauckham. An easier read is a book called Creation Care by Douglas and Jonathan Moo, which is just the most appropriate name.
Ideal, yeah.
Yeah, so we've just rubbished these two men. They're both very, very, very well regarded in their field. So, The Bible and Ecology by Richard Bauckham and Creation Care by Douglas and Jonathan Moo.
Incredible. Thanks so much, Jim. That was a really interesting episode. I've enjoyed talking about these things, and hopefully our listeners have as well. As we did this week, we'd love you to ask questions that we'll answer on next week's episode. So please do get in touch. If you are outraged by anything Jim said, I'm sure he'd love to hear that. And if you just want to follow up on anything he'd said, just let us know, and we'll address those questions next week. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.